Can you hear me? Can you hear me? In the thing. Yes? Good. That means I can stop.
Good afternoon and warm welcome to all of you, particularly the panelists, the participants, both in person and online. My colleague on my left, Mr. Pierre Soube, was mentioning that people are not used to joining a meeting starting at 2 o'clock at the WTO, so they are taking their time, I guess. And I agree with you, but colleagues are coming, and then we also have a number of people online. I think we should start in the interest of time. And first and foremost, actually, I want to introduce myself. I'm Ratnakar Adhikari. I'm the Executive Director at the Executive Secretariat for the Enhanced Integrated Framework. And I want to start by really thanking the WTO Gender team for putting together such a great show, actually, the Youth Trade Summit on Gender. Throughout yesterday and today has been a very enriching experience for many of us. And thank you very much, the team and everybody at the WTO who are involved in organizing this. I just want to start by saying that EIF as a program, which supports least developed countries to better integrate into the global trading system, it believes in the fact that trade is not necessarily gender neutral, and therefore it is important to prepare gender responsive actions, to prepare gender responsive policies as well as actions in order to move the needle in favor of gender equality. Otherwise, the gender empowerment report of World Economic Forum published in 2023 apparently says that it takes 169 years to close the gender gap, and this is not acceptable. So therefore, we have to make a proactive sort of statement and take proactive actions, proactive measures. But when it comes to diagnostic trade integration studies, those who are from the gender field may not exactly understand what is diagnostic trade integration study. These trade integration studies are the foundational document that we help LDCs to produce with the help of our partners such as the World Bank and UNCTAD, and now more and more LDCs are doing these analytical work. These documents actually identify the opportunities and challenges facing LDCs in order to integrate themselves into the global trade. And we also provide necessary support to help them to overcome the challenges as well as to maximize the opportunities. What we did so far, we have completed 55 diagnostic trade integration studies and updates in 45 least developed countries. And we issued in 2016 a new guideline incorporating the gender dimension for the first time in the DTIS guideline. And this was the time when we started the second phase of the program, and we decided that we are going to integrate 3 cross-cutting priorities: poverty, environment, and gender as 3 cross-cutting priorities. And in 2019, what we did was to initiate what is known as Empower Women Power Trade Initiative. And this Empower Women Power Trade Initiative only has done 2 things. Number one, it has actually broadened our gender women component, particularly in the programs that we implement on the ground, the activities that we support on the ground, the intervention that we support. But then we also introduced a thematic window of support, especially to provide support to projects that can help us to achieve our targets of women economic empowerment. And the results are there for everybody to see. If you look at 2022 annual report, you will see that we have achieved 61%. That's the percentage of total women beneficiaries that we have. And this is despite the fact that in 2018, our baseline was 33%. And we had set a target for ourselves to achieve by 2022, a 50% target, which we met and exceeded already in 2021, when we reached 60%. And in 2022, we reached 61%. And this would not have been possible without the support provided by the EIF donors and the effective implementation of projects on the ground by LDCs, as well as the support of the EIF agency partners such as ITC, UNDP, World Bank, UNCTAD. All of you partners and UNESCAP, all of you have actually played an active role in helping us to achieve these targets. So today, what we are trying to do is a study that we have commissioned. It's called Engendering DTISs. These analytical work, to what extent they have been able to incorporate gender dimension, not only incorporating is one thing, but implement the priority actions that have been identified in the DTISs is something that is being undertaken by our expert, senior trade and gender expert, Carmen Soprano, and he has been leading this work, and he will then be presenting this with us this afternoon. Then followed by that, we will have a panel discussion, and we've got an eminent panel today led by Miss Dorothy Tembo, who is the Deputy Executive Director of International Trade Center, and she was the Executive Director of the EIF, and that was the time she introduced the gender component within the EIF program, and I just I together with my team just carried it forward. Thank you very much for being the trailblazer, and I would then like to introduce my colleague on my left, Mr. Pierre Soube, who is the senior economist at the senior trade economist specialist at the World Bank here in Geneva, who is also an EIF board member and somebody who has supported the DTIS studies in a number of countries in the past. And I also have with me my colleague Hang Tran, who is the senior coordinator, and who has probably led almost more than 25 DTISs in more than 20 countries so far, and she would probably have some insight to offer. So without further ado, I would like to invite you, Carmen, to make the presentation. And once you make the presentation, we will start the panel discussion. Over to you, Carmen.
Thank you very much, Ratnakar. And with your permission, I will stand up in the hope everyone can hear me and the interpreters can also work smoothly. Because my job here is obviously to present the findings of the report. But since this is also a session right after lunch, I have a paramount mission to keep you all awake. And so I hope this will work better for that purpose. So I want to start by sincerely thanking all those who made it possible. Okay, for us to do this, and therefore the EIF for championing this assignment and offering me the opportunity to work on it as an independent researcher. Then the WTO for hosting us at these wonderful premises, and particularly my very good friends from the WTO Trade and Gender Hub for putting together the session and making room for it in the very busy and very exciting program of the ongoing Youth Summit. But I also want to thank each and every one of you for being with us today. I know it's not obvious. There are many compelling engagements, but we do look forward to receiving your feedback on this work. So this is our road ahead for today. I'm going to briefly touch on the context for this assignment and present the methodology and related limitations. But then I'll spend a little bit more time on some of the approaches and trends that emerged from integrating gender into drug diagnostics, on some highlights from implementation of gender-sensitive DTIS recommendations, and on some good practices and lessons learned. And then I'll conclude with some recommendations. But hold on to it, because recommendations are just the starting point. And part of the purpose of today's event is precisely the one of gathering your own views in terms of what else needs to be done or how better those recommendations will be enhanced. So stay with us through the end of it, because there will be a time for you to offer feedback via poll. Okay, in terms of context, I'll take this from a little bit sort of far away just to see where we've come from. And Ratnak already anticipated that we have come a long way, including at the EIF. So I'm sure everybody in the room realizes that by now we have a crystal clear business case for gender equality, meaning we have sufficient evidence suggesting that pursuing gender in anything we do, and therefore also in trade diagnostics, make perfect economic sense. Sure, we all know about SDG 5. Many of us will have read about this 2015 McKinsey report, estimating that up to $28 trillion could have been added to the global economy if all gender gaps were to be closed by 2025. These were pre-COVID-19 estimates, but still very important to give us a sense of the magnitude of the economic opportunity associated with gender. And then I'm very sure everyone is familiar with the Buenos Aires Declaration and the whole global trade and gender momentum it puts into action. All of these issues are particularly relevant in least developed countries, the ones that the EIF focuses on, because for reasons that I'm sure, again, everybody knows very well, women alongside other vulnerable categories are disproportionately more affected by issues such as poverty, fragility, and others. So this is the broader context. Then when it comes to the EIF more specifically, Ratnakar already talked about these 2016 guidelines that in the context of the beginning of phase 2 of the enhanced integrated framework identified gender alongside other cross-cutting issues as priorities to be pursued. And then the 2019 to 2022 strategic plan that the EIF built on that and broken down into specific objectives that EIF work should have pursued in that 3-year period, insofar as gender more specifically was concerned. In terms of mainstreaming gender indeed into anything that is done at the EIF, in terms of supporting associations of women traders and female entrepreneurs, in terms of prioritizing value chains and sectors that are known to be dominated by women, and in terms of exploring partnerships with many excellent entities, some of which are represented in the room today, that are already pursuing excellent work on trade and gender. This is the context against which we set ourselves to the mission of assessing the extent to which existing DTISs had or had not integrated gender. In order for us to do that, we use 3 stages, 4 colors, 5 criteria. First, we reviewed DTISs conducted in all of the 45 countries supported by the EIF, as Ratnakar already indicated. Second, we conducted a more in-depth desk review on the technical substance of those diagnostics trade integration studies that had showed some signs of integration of gender, and that was our long list. And thirdly, we then used 15 of those to put together a short list of DTISs for which we conducted stakeholder interviews. The 4 colors I will not spoil right now. I do want you all to go back to the report and find out more about that. But the one color I want to highlight here is red. because we thought it would be very important not only to learn about the good practices of DTISs that had integrated gender, but also the reasons why some had not actually done so. And so those were highlighted in red in our 4-color system and also added to the short list so that we could find out more from our stakeholders. What is more important is the 5 criteria that were used and systematically applied to all of the 4 steps of the DTIS process. Again, I won't spend any time detailing those. I'm sure you all know them by heart, but the 5 criteria I do want to spend a little bit more time on. First, we'll look for integration. So the extent to which there were any signs of gender into any section of each trait diagnostic. Second, we checked for thoroughness. Was there any use of sex-aggregated trait data in the study? Were there international trait and gender literature sources cited? Was there any thematic analytical deep dive in sectors that are known to be dominated by women? The presence of those signs, it was what made us deem or deem not a certain DTIS as gender thorough. Then we also looked at the action matrix of each of the studies and checked for the extent to which gender analysis included in the body of the report had translated into gender-sensitive recommendations. And then for those studies that were shortlisted and for which interviews were also conducted, we looked at the extent to which the DTIS process had been inclusive in terms of involving gender ministries, associations of women traders and female entrepreneurs, as well as relevant other gender entities. And we also searched for evidence of implementation of those gender-sensitive DTIS actions. Were there any limitations? Of course, there were. And so we will not hide that the sample size of interviews that we conducted with DTIS stakeholders was not terribly large, 23 in total, but still totaling 1 to 2 on average per DTIS shortlisted. So not bad in the end. Also, as you may imagine, sometimes it was not exactly easy to find evidence of progress against the implementation of DTIS gender actions. So we obviously checked online. We looked for existing reports or other project documents. We followed up with country counterparts. We did what we could. And then finally, again, some of you may know that the DTIS has been existing as a cornerstone of EIF's analytical work for many years now. And so for some of these studies that were reviewed, the gender assessment that we conducted came in quite a bit after the actual study had passed. And so some years had passed in between. This is the methodology. What did we find? Well, it turned out that about 1/3 of all of the DTISs that we reviewed showed some signs of gender integration, with an interesting distinction between the post-2016 so-called new generation trait diagnostics, those that followed the 2016 EIF guidelines, and typically showed a tendency to more systematically and more thoroughly integrate gender into the studies, versus older ones, which if they did so, usually integrated gender on a more occasional and less thorough way. Also, there seems to exist different ways of integrating gender into the studies. Some more recent ones, such as those conducted in Bhutan, Equatorial Guinea, South Sudan, and Tanzania, used what we got to call the horizontal integration. So we read through the study from top to bottom, and there was gender pretty much in every single section. Executive summary, the opening chapter with the macroeconomic context, and then each of the thematic chapter of the diagnostic. And this seem to be typically associated with the presence of gender language in the terms of reference of the study, as well as a trait and gender expert on the DTIS team. Older studies instead seem to show more of a tendency to integrate gender vertically. There was no gender from top to bottom of the report, but there were some sections or subsections or chapters or boxes that offered small, yet sometimes still thorough deep dives on gender. And then thirdly, very interestingly, in my very humble opinion, there were a few studies where we observed where we got to call a gender sectorial poll. This was the case of DTISs, where the idea of integrating gender was not part of the equation at the beginning, But then as the study team focused on sectors that were known to be naturally dominated by women, it became a no-brainer that they should have put their own gender lenses on. And this was the case of the informal cross-border trade chapter of the Malawi DTIS, of the fisheries chapter of the Gambia DTIS, and of the forestry chapter of the Solomon Islands DTIS. We also noted that the quality of the gender analysis and therefore its thoroughness tended to increase over time, included, as I said earlier, in terms of the use of the adequate terminology, the citation of trade and gender international literature sources, and or the use of sexist aggregated trade data. And for those DTISs that did integrate study, the operationalization of the analysis into gender-sensitive action matrix recommendations was usually generally good. The stakeholder process also seemed to be generally inclusive for the studies that did incorporate gender, although the integration of feedback gathered from gender ministry or women's associations was less clear in some cases. And then what we thought was very, very interesting was the fact that we came across a few studies where, while there was some gender at some point throughout the report, then as we read through the issue, started to progressively fade out and eventually disappeared. There was no sign of gender into the recommendations, and the whole issue had evaporated throughout the report. We call this gender evaporation. These are some of the approaches and trends. Now, when it comes to implementation highlights, again, I don't want to spoil the report, so I do encourage you all to go to the annexes, of which there are many attached to it. Well, you will find the results of the gender assessment of every single DTIS that we reviewed, including evidence where available of implementation of gender-sensitive actions. But I do want to offer you some examples because we found many. There were cases where specific trade and gender follow-up studies had been conducted after the DTIS had looked at gender more generically. There were other instances where there were technical assistance projects included, supported by the EIF, as well as by other donors, as it was the case of Lao PDR. Or there were countries like Malawi, where the work done around gender and informal cross-border trade resulted into a number of policy developments and also technical assistance interventions, including one supported by our friends from the UNCTAD's Trade and Gender team. So a lot happened. And even for those countries that did not integrate gender, again, I think this is very interesting. In some cases, we still found traces of gender progress, as it was the case of Bangladesh and Burkina, among others. Why? Well, we assumed that this was due to the fact that they could just not resist this global trade and gender momentum that I presented in the context session. And therefore, even though there had not been any gender analysis in the actual report, they still designed and implemented technical assistance projects, offered trainings, or did value chain related work specific to gender. And finally, there were cases where the analysis had been very, very good. And despite lack of progress for some country-specific circumstances, there were still important signs of a gender momentum. This was the case of the Tanzania DTS, which is singled out as a good practice for integrating gender into trade diagnostics. I will not disclose my conflict of interest here because I happen to be part of the team of World Bank experts that did the study back then. But that aside, I think the most substantive part of it is the fact that there were a number of features in this study that we thought would make sense for any future trade diagnostics to try to systematically integrate gender. Among others, there was, again, gender mentioned in the terms of reference and associated to an expert on the DTIS team. There was vertical and horizontal integration of the topic, plus some deep dives. There were extensive associations with women in all of the three key sectors analyzed in the study, and therefore women in agriculture, women in extractive industries, and women in tourism. And there were various gender-sensitive action matrix recommendations included in it. This leads us to identify some good practices and also some lessons that we think were learned from country teams based on those studies. Some of those practices I've already mentioned, but it's good to package it all together. So in our very humble opinion, integrating gender vertically can be good to have thematic deep dives, but doing it horizontally is preferable because you want to have it from top to bottom to the extent possible. And ideally, you want to aim for both. Second, engaging with women in the grassroots is key. Again, this may sound trivial, but it is not. And in some cases, you really want to go where your female beneficiaries are to be able to gather their inputs on your research. And for instance, here we're bringing up the example of a workshop with cross-border traders from Malawi and also Zambia that was held in the grassroots at the border between Malawi and Zambia, precisely with the idea of gathering feedback from female beneficiaries on the ground about the gender-specific challenges in cross-border trade. Third, sometimes it can be very tough to identify trade and gender expertise at country level. And in that case, there may be sources of expertise in industries that are known to be dominated by women. That was the case of the Lao PDR, where the female industry representative from one of these sectors actually was used as one of the experts. And similarly, I'm sure we all know that there are many valuable sources of international trade and gender expertise that we can always tap into when country expertise is not available. That was the case of the Gambia fisheries gender section, which was done with technical support from our friends in UNCTAD. It was also the case of the gender analysis of the Yemen DTIS, which was conducted by UNDP experts. And then finally, may seem trivial, but again, I'm sure we all can imagine that trade diagnostics are targeted to a very rich and diverse audience, including readers that may not have prior background on gender. So you want to make sure that whatever analysis is included is also visualized in a way that is reader-friendly and that highlight the key issues. What lessons did we learn? Well, first, there seems to be issues associated with low levels of institutional awareness. And there were many national implementation units which unfortunately face such challenges. So it's always very important to check out for those. Second, there seems to exist a pretty frustrating equation whereby no gender in terms of reference, budget, and team is equal to limited and or poor quality analysis. So it's important to make sure that there are allocation of resources and expertise in that. And then thirdly, champions can be key to drive the issue forward. And sometimes champions may be easier to find than you may think, as it was the case of the Lao PDR DTIS, where the chairperson of the EIF steering committee at the time happened to be a woman who drove the issue forward very vocally, or the Mauritius DTIS, where the trade minister, who at the time again was a woman, was instrumental to raising visibility about the findings of the study. Finally, let's bring this all together with our trade and gender pocket guide. May sound like Lonely Planet. It's actually a lot cooler than that, because we hope it can be a 10-point list of practical recommendations that you all can take forward as you embark in future trade and gender diagnostics. Again, some of which have been mentioned already. Some of them have been mentioned, so I'll be a little quick on some. First, always make sure to integrate gender in the terms of reference, in the budget, and in the team composition of your diagnostic. Second, scan for gender champions, ideally locally, along the lines of the examples I just made for Lao PDR and Mauritius. Third, make sure to always include analysis and sexes aggregated data in the opening section of your diagnostic. That nice little macroeconomic chapter that sort of sets the stage for the rest of the thematic analysis. If you do well there, chances are that that will sort of drive the rest of the gender analysis on its own. Fourth, ideally, as we said, aim for horizontal and vertical integration. And then fifth, consider ad hoc data collection. We all know how frustrating it can be to be dealing with limited sexes aggregated data. And plus, there are some sectors such as informal trade where limited availability of analytical information is just a default issue. When that is the case, you may want to consider running ad hoc data collection exercises or other surveys, which will not only inform the richness of your report, but also, more importantly, leave behind an additional baseline of sexes aggregated trade data. Six, engage obviously with gender ministries, with associations of women traders and female entrepreneurs, but also with the many focal points that do exist with line agencies. You will be surprised by how many there are around the world. And yes, I know they face myriad of financial, technical, and other challenges, but those are the very people you might want to bring on board and carry along this gender trade journey so that they can help you out in finalizing the study, in operationalizing its actions, and in raising raising awareness within their own institution. 7, use gender-sensitive channels to gather inputs and feedback. You will see a Mentimeter survey in a second in this presentation. That's probably not the best way to raise feedback from poor little women in rural areas of certain LDCs. So when that's the case, use workshops, maybe in local languages, or other forms of engaging with them, be them drama groups or role-play games or other form of non-written communications that directly speak to the specific communication preferences of your target audience. 8, prioritize, obviously, gender recommendations in your action matrix and always check for evaporation. And then 9, as you draft those, make sure they are clear, meaning they are clearly understandable by anybody who reads your report. They are pertinent and therefore directly speak to the gender analysis included in the main body of the report, and they are actionable. So any other player interested in following up on that can actually implement them. And then if you will also cost and time those, then you will have been a gender superstar. And then last but not least, make sure to bring all the relevant parties along your gender trade journey, including those donors and international entities that we all know have a special interest in gender. They will offer you technical insights into the report that will help you enrich the final version of it, and they could be natural candidates for further taking the work forward through operationalization of the recommendations. That's the end of it as far as we're concerned, but now it's your job to give us more suggestions, because we've prepared a little survey for you all, as we think we have 10 points that we can recommend, but there's a lot more that can be done. So we're asking you to scan the QR code and offer 3 concrete recommendations for things that you think should be done to further integrate gender into trade diagnostics. We're going to give you all a couple of seconds to offer your recommendations, and then we're going to show you the results, and then I'll leave it at that, because I think that's a nice segue for the expert panel discussion that will follow.
Thank you very much, Carmen, for this enriching presentation. And I'm actually looking at reading your report earlier, even before this presentation, learned a lot. I mean, gender evaporation, what does it mean? I mean, this was new to me when it appeared for the first time. And I realized that it really, this evaporation is really a thing that happens in many, many cases. So sometimes in the beginning, you are super excited. You want to do a lot, but then you end up not having enough resources, enough expertise, or enough political will to implement some of these priority actions. Then evaporation occurs. Anyway, thank you very much. So I hope you have already got the QR code and putting in the system. You want to have a look at the result?
Here we go. There's a lot of different exciting suggestions. I will not go into the details of that, Ratnakar, if you agree. Maybe we can leave it up there, and that maybe can be a source of inspiration for further discussion. And we are definitely going to take very good note of these suggestions as we finalize the report, including by integrating feedback from all concerned parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you especially for those 10 commandments. These are super helpful. Now, without further ado, I want to start the panel discussion, and for which I would like to start off by inviting Dorothy. And my question to you, Dorothy, if I may, is that since ITC has been implementing several gender and trade priorities, gender and trade priorities, particularly some of them emanating from the DTIS. So what has been your experience in implementing those priority actions, and what are the key success stories, and what are the challenges? Over to you, Dorothy.
Thank you very much, Ratnakar. And I wanted to start by expressing our gratitude for the invitation that was extended to be a part of this important conversation this afternoon. We say thanks to the WTO as well for facilitating that. A real pleasure, I think, to be amongst many young professionals and researchers in the room, because I think it's you that are going to shape the conversations around trade and gender in a very innovative and exciting way. So it's really a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback. I wanted perhaps to start by taking a bit of a step back, and maybe this starts from the point that you made, Ratnaka, earlier on, which was that I had the privilege of perhaps serving within the IF and EIF framework from very different perspectives. I think one is the one that you alluded to, that I had the opportunity to lead the EIF team many years back. But in addition to that, being part of the government of Zambia trade team, I was also the IF focal point before I moved to the WTO. So in that sense, I perhaps have seen the utilization of DTISs from different perspectives, and perhaps have a little bit more of an understanding as to where I think some of the issues might be. But that is also one that builds on what we are currently doing as our contribution to the EIF in the implementation process, which will bring me to the specific question that has been raised. I think, in my view, we are at the point where we all understand first and foremost that gender is not really an option at this point. If I look at the delegation conversations we have from the ITC perspective, each and every delegation that we speak to are really focused on trying to see what it is that can be done in the context of gender, in terms of the support that is coming from ourselves and indeed from the other partners that we are working with. So it's not so much about proving the point, it's the how of doing this, I think, that we have been grappling with over the years. How do we translate a well-intended important issue that has been integrated in some cases to a very high degree within the context of the DTISs operationally on the ground? Because this is really what we are dealing with. I think having it in a document and moving from having it in the document and really translating this operationally, taking into account that you have different parts of the different ministries and institutions at the country level, is what is really the challenge. And this is one of the issues that we have observed as an organization that is supporting countries to implement the various EIF gender-related programs. It comes up very often. Goodwill, perhaps from one ministry, but from the other institutions not coming through. And this cannot work unless everybody is moving on the same footing, resources are coming through to accompany any implementation program that is there. So I wanted, perhaps in responding to first and foremost applaud you, Ratnaka, for the excellent leadership you're providing on this particular aspect, as well as the EIF team for the dedication towards ensuring that DTISs are moving in a direction where we're really able to deliver on gender equality. It's going to take a bit of time, but I think we are all moving in the right direction. I also wanted to perhaps focus on 2 points, which I wanted to share today, having drawn from some of the implementation experiences on gender. First, what we have established over the years that we have been working with the kind support of EIF in Zambia, in the Gambia, in Rwanda, where we really have established that it's good from our perspective, which is focused mainly on building capacity for micro, small, and medium enterprises relating to women. And everything I say is very much, through that lens. So If you see me perhaps leaning towards one side, just understand that this is the area of work that we have been doing. I think it's whilst we understand that building the capacity of women-led businesses to trade is important, we have also established that this can only get them so far unless we have a supportive business environment for businesses in particular, which is why from our perspective, we have developed the She Trades Outlook to help policymakers evaluate what the business environment looks like for women-led MSMEs. And in so doing that, this opens the way for designing policy reforms that direct themselves to the right issues. I think earlier on, there was a presentation on data. This is really, from our experience, has been one of the challenges that has been confronting us. Having disaggregated data, up-to-date disaggregated data that will be able to give you the storyline for each specific country, so that from that assessment, you are then very focused in terms of the response. So what we have done within the context of this tool that I have referred to is to make sure that we are moving in with a number of indicators that we assess with the countries to determine exactly where the issues might be, where countries are doing well, that we are also informing them where they're doing well, but more so where they're not, what is it that would need to be addressed? And we've done this work in 50 countries. So the same, I think, it's one side to do this externally. What we have also learned is that this information is going to be critical from our side in terms of the responses that we provide to countries. So using this analysis to determine what type of support we provide together with our partners. And I keep stressing our partners because in terms of the level of response that is required, it cannot be done by one institution. There are many aspects to this, and we need to ensure that we can actually be able to get to that point. And very quickly, I wanted to zoom in terms of one single policy area that we have focused on, because I think it's one aspect to have the DTIS outlining the issues, but for businesses, they want to know what's in it for them. And from our perspective, we've been trying to better define that in terms of the response that we are giving. And here we have been working very actively in the area of public procurement. I think you gave some statistics earlier on, which give a sense of what could be achieved. And we see this as a very specific area where women's participation could actually be enhanced. I think public procurement as it stands now, it accounts for anywhere between 10 to 40% of any country's GDP. So you can only imagine what potential there would be for women to participate. Where we are right now is that we only have 1% currently going to women-led businesses. It's starting to slowly change, but there's still lots of work. And we are doing some of this in the Gambia, in Zambia, where we're developing gender responsive public procurement policies, but on the other hand, also working with the businesses to ensure that you don't have the policy and you're not able to supply, but that the policy is there and you're able to supply of quality and consistency. So perhaps I could stop here, but there are many, many aspects, I think, which were spoken to by Carmen, which really align with what we have established as part of all the work that we have done in relation to pushing forward the implementation of the various DTISs in countries where we are working, because that's our starting point. It's the national plan plus what has been done in the context of the DTISs. What I leave on the table is that no need to duplicate efforts. There's plenty that we are doing, trying to coordinate our efforts better to have a more effective response is what we would need going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Excellent. particularly hats off to you on that point. No need to duplicate the efforts, and let's try and coordinate all our efforts so that we are able to achieve our common objectives. Thank you so much. Now I would like to move to Pierre, and a simple question to you, Pierre, is if you can share if you have any lessons from the development of DTISs, several of those, and implementing some of the priority actions identified, including through a gender lens. If you can share that with us, it'll be appreciated.
I don't have any views on that. I'm depressed. I'm the oldest person in this room attending a youth summit. Think about it. Let me give you a math quiz. I am, and this is true, in the 8th decade of my existence on Earth. How old am I? And then you'll understand why I'm depressed. And because I'm so old, I was thinking instead of doing it standing up the way Carmine was doing it, I would do it lying down. Because after lunch, I usually want to just lie down and have a nap. But that wouldn't work for the interpreters. This is the cool, Michael, do you agree? This is the coolest room in the house. If only those curtains were opened up, you would see why negotiating rounds of the WTO never conclude. Because you would see the majestic beauty of Geneva and say, why would I want this party to end? This city is so beautiful, the per diem is so good. Let the party roll on. I have no comments really to make. I agree with everything Carmine said and welcome all questions you may want to direct to him. No, that would not work, would it?
No, it would
okay. Let me try to say a few things. First, of course, thank you, Ratnakar, for associating me to this event, and Simon. I am an EIF board member, and any initiative that allows me as a board member to reflect on and draw lessons from what the EIF does and think about ways of improving the way it does it are things that I very much welcome. And that means I have to congratulate my quasi-colleague, Carmine, for his excellent note. I think it's a very useful piece of work. It's a work in progress, in my view, because we're dealing with the work in progress on trade and gender. And even though I think there is an Everest, or I should say in Switzerland, a Matterhorn of empirical evidence on the development and gender nexus, if you want, this is a very burgeoning field. We don't have a Matterhorn of empirical information on trade and gender. And it was very interesting to see that the word that came up the most in the exercise you just did was data. We at the World Bank produced just over a year ago a really fascinating study called The Distributional Impacts of Trade, DIOT. I'm glad there was not a word starting with I before that, because that would mean idiot. That would be embarrassing. But the Distributional Impacts of Trade did 5 country case studies in Bangladesh, in Brazil, in Mexico, in Sri Lanka, and in South Africa. The study is on our website. I really encourage you to go to it. None of those case studies were really about gender, but almost all of those case studies drew inferences about the differentiated impact that trade interventions have on different categories of workers, on different sectors, on different communities, and you can easily infer gendered outcomes, even though they were not the primary focus of our work. Thank you. Even on a gray day, it's spectacular. On a gray November day with limited visibility. Now, the findings in our study were really fascinating. And what struck me the most is how counterintuitive they were. And so let me just give you a couple of examples. For example, in Brazil, trade liberalization did not result in significant job gains, neither for men or women, because of the sheer difficulty for people to move to new locations where export growth and job growth was happening. Why? Because they could not dispose of their real estate assets. You could not easily sell a house. It's extremely expensive to get rid of a house or to sell a house. Transaction costs are very high, holds people back and unable to reallocate resources towards areas of growth. Another example in Bangladesh, counterexample, the ease with which people were able to move to areas of export growth, particularly in the ready garments industry, created an overabundance of labor supply, the impact of which was to actually depress wages in that sector. And of course, who experienced the greatest wage depression? Who works in the ready garment industry? Primarily women. The reason I give these examples, and I could go through the 5 countries' case studies, South Africa, fascinating case study of how apartheid, how the legacy of apartheid continues in communities that were excluded from the mainstream, weighs on their ability to acquire the skills required to be more productive workers and to work in industries that have perhaps higher labor productivity. And so what these lessons teach us is that when you work on trade and gender, for example, and when we're concerned about making trade inclusive, you really have to think outside the box and reach out beyond trade policy and the instruments of trade governance and the impact of trade agreements. You've got to be thinking about issues like education and zoning laws and real estate regulation and so on and so forth. The existence or not of social safety nets, the ability to bargain over your wages, the presence of unionization, the right to unionize, and so on and so forth. And I think this is a very important lesson. I bring it into a trade and gender context and to a DTIS context because it seems to suggest to me the centrality of more data, of more research, of more applied policy research, of more case studies, and therefore of, as Dorothy was saying, of more bankable projects that are rooted in proper diagnostics. And that's a life cycle. We have to first be able to diagnose and then make recommendations based on our analytical diagnosis, and then translate that into bankable projects, and then be able to measure and evaluate their impact. That's a tall order. We are not there yet for the most part. ITC probably has the greatest experience in advancing this agenda, but we're still, I would argue, very much in a learning by doing mode, almost at each moment of that life cycle. You know, in reading Carmine's note, I was struck by the fact that pre-2016, gender was a footnote. It's amazing, Carmine, that there was even any reference to gender. You know, those are like prehistoric days. So in a way, trade and gender as an object of economic inquiry within trade, I would say it's a post-2017. It took MC11 and the Buenos Aires Declaration to really sort of endogenize this issue in the thinking about trade governance, of the role of gender in trade and in trade governance. 2017, December 2017, that's not even 6 years ago. So you should not expect miracles. What can we do over 6 years? And 2 of those 6 years were COVID. Forget about it. You know, nothing happened during COVID. We can do anything. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that we should be patient. We should be humble in what we do. But pretty much everything lies ahead of us. And that's a real challenge. And it's a challenge that you as a research community can inform. Every one of these elements of the life cycle, every one of these moments in the life cycle, diagnosis, recommendations, project design, project assessment, are areas in which we need empirical evidence, qualitative and empirical. Sometimes you cannot measure. Sometimes it's more qualitative in nature. And that's the challenge you guys face. 2 more observations. We need training. We need better access to sort of systematic information of what doing rigorous gendered analysis means. I don't know what it means. And I've been in this game for what, 35 years. But this is a new issue. So I need access to a handbook. I need access to, proper metrics to guide me in the work I'm going to do. And I mentioned this to Simon over lunch. This is Carmine's next project. This is the next thing you're going to fund for him. Or I would say maybe with Simonetta, because Simonetta is retiring in 2 months. She'll have a lot of time on her hands. Maybe Carmine and, the Italian connection, the 2 of you could work together on this. That would be great. But we need to systematize access to knowledge. Now, I'm not going to wrap up. I mean, this is super interesting, no? I'm going to take my time. Just like Carmina did. I'm almost finished, Ratnakar, don't worry. So that's one thing. We need to train the people who are going to conduct the analyses. We need to train NIU members. We need to train local NGOs because, they may understand gender, but they don't understand really trade and gender. So the whole ecosystem of training that needs to be done. There are bits and pieces of that around town, but in a more systematic, user-friendly way. I think that product does not yet exist. And then finally, I would say on gender evaporation, which is a very cute term. I really like that term. Yes, that you really put your finger on an important thing. It's one thing to observe. It's another thing to act upon it. And again, this puts into question really the 2 central aspects of recommending in a granular enough way policy responses to what you've diagnosed as a problem. And then, of course, it's up to us to implement projects that are actually going to generate meaningful outcomes. And then my final observation, you'll be happy to hear the word final, is that gender is only one element of inclusivity. And here I'm not going to make friends with my female friends, probably. I think we should be focusing. I work for a development organization, and we are obsessed with making trade more inclusive. But that's not just gender. And it's not only women. It's what do we do about MSMEs who are disadvantaged? What do we do about LDCs? How do we raise their game? What do we do about young workers, male or female, young workers and entrepreneurs, not only women? And so I think as we go down the road and as concerns about inclusivity gain greater currency, the focus on gender is going to have to be woven into a broader canvas. And that canvas opens up, again, huge new opportunities for policy research, in which gender will continue forever to be a central issue, but not the only issue. And so my call to you is to say, how can you bring a broader lens to the work that you do? Let me stop there.
Thank you. So in the interest of time now, let me invite our last speaker. And Hang, I was actually exchanging side note via WhatsApp with her. And I told her that now onus is on you to be very brief. So in 3 minutes, Hang, if you have any country example to share, please feel free to share.
Thank you so much, Ranaka. I'm depressed now because not only because I have a 2 minute or 3 minute left, but I'm speaking after the 2 eminent speakers who used to be my mentors somehow for gender. So 3 points. One is clear that finding from DTIS, either vertical or horizontal, are extremely useful for technical assistance, from being EIF, but I heard loudly from Dorothy that for ITC, to kind of, mainstreaming the gender element in the project design, mainstreaming gender in National Development Plan and other Aid for Trade programs. And then for the broader picture at Pierre mentioned, for the second point I try to make is, yes, great picture, but small way, small step to help woman economic empowerment is important. And we need a very dedicated approach when we talk about woman economic empowerment. Two country example here. DTIS of Malawi 2013 identify, among other things, small farmer holders. So we had a project with supporting small farming anchor farm, but we discovered to get women, I mean, most of the farmers, to go to work in that anchor farm, we need to find a way to have, the place for their children to be kept. So nobody think about a kindergarten to be built in the anchor farm. But yes, with the finding in the DTIS, somehow not directly, we managed to include a kindergarten in the project design, and it makes a huge differences. Similar example in Burkina Faso, when we find the cashew nut sector is the key sector in the DTIS, we invite the chairman of the Cashew Nut Association to sit in the National Steering Committee, and she brought in experience, and she learned from that committee are the challenges faced by women. Back in her association, she created a microfinance system for women working in the cashew factory, and a marketplace where women can bring in their product, either cake or textile handicraft to sell. So that a kind of, small thing to motivate household women to come to work in the industries. So all that coming from here and there, the finding in the DTIS. The third point I want to bring in, and I conclude my 2 minutes, is, cost-cutting sector, cost-cutting issues. Approaching the women economic empowerment, we need to do it in a kind of, promoting learning by doing networking, partnership, and coordinations. And for that to happen, we have a great, partnership with UNCTAD. I have a Simonetta here. We provide together with UNCTAD training on gender responsive policy. We work with UNSCAP to have a great regional project on training women entrepreneurs on e-commerce. And from that, we learned that, training women, again, we need a dedicated approach, because the sisterhood emerged in that training is quite important. And it's instrumental, and also building the confidence for women by having a self-help group together. So
Thank
yes.
you. Thank you, Han. I mean, these are very, very useful insights from countries. No, the reason I just wanted to stop you there is to invite at least 3 questions, because we still have 2 or 3 minutes. So any questions or interventions from the floor would be greatly appreciated.
I apologize to my World Bank colleagues. I don't intend to put a light on you, but you spoke quite a lot about the DTIS. Oh, sorry, my name is Mila, and I work for the World Bank in Angola. So you spoke about the DTIS and how we can use diagnostics to kind of inform project design, further policy design in the future, perhaps through the recommendations that we have. But I think that, and I have to ask you if it is not also important to have local experts, and this is why I'm saying apologies to my World Bank colleagues, local experts to conduct surveys that are more targeted to specific challenges such as gender. Because sometimes what you know about gender in Asia may be very different from what you find out about gender in different country contexts. So Carmen, for you, I'd like to know what approach would you be working towards in the future to ensure that you are actually gathering the reality in the country with someone, let's say, preferably a female expert, that will be better, in a better capacity to collect such data. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a very good question. Few other questions, a couple of questions more. Yeah. If there, I think there's none. Ask Pierre to respond to that question, and maybe Carmen, if you want to jump in relation to the local content requirement, not local content, right? So locally driven knowledge and expertise, how best and how effectively we can utilize.
I have no views on that. No. So, I mean, I think it all is a question of how you compose teams that produce a DTIS. I don't think DTISs are produced by some international expert that flies in and knows the answers to all questions. And I think in Carmina's note, there's a very nice recommendation of actually embedding that local knowledge, because, you know, that knowledge will produce results which will be highly context specific. You don't address gender issues in Peru in the same way that you do in Kuwait. They play out very differently, although I don't think there'll be a DTIS in either of those countries. But anyway, I just emphasize that. So I think it's a question of how we use the resources at our disposal in producing a DTIS to embed not only a diversity of views, but also embed local knowledge as much as we can. And I think, you know, in the production of most DTISs, that an attempt is made to do that. I don't know if that was the case in Angola, maybe not. It seems the Angola DTIS was an outlier in every respect, but I leave it at that.
Thank you. Carmen, just 1 minute. We need to wrap up. Sorry about that.
Absolutely. Let me sincerely thank Mila for raising a very, very important point. And the truth is, this is what should be done in principle, and that to the extent possible does happen already. Those of you who are familiar with DTISs or maybe have had a chance to produce one or more actually would know that generally the idea is that for every thematic area of the study, there is one international expert and one local expert. Okay. Now, the extent to which this is actually possible for every single LDC for trade and gender, I don't know. And the reality is that there are some country contexts where precisely because, as Pierre was saying, we're only in year 6 of the existence of this topic as a global issue, there simply not exist yet a large enough pool of local expertise. That's why one of the recommendations of our report is around always making sure you have gender explicitly mentioned in terms of reference, always make sure you have budget allocated to gender work, and always make sure that you leverage trade and gender experts, be them international and local. And on a closing note, I think that building that local pool of trade and gender expertise is exactly what initiatives like this very summit are for, bringing together practitioners, researchers, the future advocates and champions of trade and gender all around the world, including in LDCs, so that in a couple of years from now, we can actually have that local base of trade and gender expertise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen. So 1 more minute. Now for Dorothy, 1 minute. Yes, fine.
Actually, I think Carmen just took what I was going to say.
I stole it.
Yeah.
No, just supporting what you have said, that, you know, one, we do have structures. I mean, moving forward with implementing a DTIS is not done in isolation from the institutional structures that you have on the ground. And those structures should be able to identify where or who needs to be involved, but also how you try to build the capacity going beyond that initial pool of expertise. So I think that process does allow countries to actually be able to move in a direction where you're building this capacity. I personally think where it's warranted that you have external capacity, I think that should be allowed, with the view of ensuring that you have entrenched, some sustainability strategy that progressively builds the capacity at the local level. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And sorry, Hang, I can't provide you time. Dealing with board members and then, high level people is difficult, but dealing with you, is not a problem. So, on behalf of Hang and myself and Simon and rest of the team, I would really like to thank you as the panelist and those who are participating here in person and online for this wonderful session that you've helped us to conduct. The only one point that I want to mention is that we've received extremely valuable feedback and suggestion from most of you, and these would be incorporated in the report, and the final report would be submitted and will be circulated to all of you, and it will be put on our website, and you would have the opportunity to have a look at it. Thank you very much.